Welcome to Nightmare Whispers, where the rain falls and the shadows whisper. Tonight, let your fears take shape as you drift into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you enjoy the chills. Now, close your eyes and listen. I don't think my neighbor is dead. I mean, they should be. I saw the body. Let me back up a bit. I moved into this basement suite in the spring. Not the best place I've ever lived. The ceiling's so low I can press my palm flat against it without getting on my toes. Heating works when it feels like it. I've killed more spiders than I care to count, most of them crawling out of the tiny windows that are supposed to let in light but mostly just invite things in. But it was cheap, and I needed cheap. So I took it. For a while, the upstairs was empty. Quiet. I almost started thinking I got lucky. Then the new tenant moved in. Older guy. Maybe in his 60s. Gray beard, kind of wiry build, but hunched like he carried more weight than you could see. Never introduced himself. I only caught a glimpse of him once or twice, coming in or out. He kept to himself. Fine by me. I'm not exactly the neighborly type. But even when I didn't see him, I heard him. Mostly at night. He'd walk. That's all. Just walk. Back and forth, over and over. Sometimes from midnight to 4 or 5 in the morning. The pacing never really stopped until the sun started coming up. You'd think it'd get on your nerves, but it was almost rhythmic. Predictable. At least at first. Then came the scratching. At first, I figured it was mice. This is the kind of place where you'd expect mice. It'd happen around 3 a.m., little bursts of sound, sharp and frantic, like claws on drywall. And always after the pacing stopped. He'd walk, then the scratching would start. Like something was following him through the walls. I tried to ignore it. Until I started hearing the whispering. At first it was so faint I thought it was coming from my phone. Just this quiet murmur above my head, too muffled to make out. I turned everything off. Still heard it. I put my ear right up to the ceiling, held my breath. That's when I heard the words. Let me back in. Over and over. The voice sounded dry. Like wind blowing through old leaves. I don't know how else to explain it. The more I listened, the more wrong it felt. I stopped sleeping through the night. Coffee, podcasts, whatever, I did what I could to stay awake until daylight. It helped. A little. Then, 2 weeks ago, everything stopped. No footsteps. No scratching. No whispering. Just silence. Not peaceful silence either. The kind that makes you realize how loud nothing can be. It rang in my ears. I figured the guy had moved out, or maybe he'd passed away quietly. I thought about going upstairs, but I didn't want to get involved. I don't poke my nose where it doesn't belong. That changed a few days later, when the smell started. If you've ever smelled something dead, and I mean really dead, you know what I'm talking about. It's sour, coppery and thick. It clings to your lungs. I couldn't breathe in the hallway without gagging. That's when I finally caved. I wrapped a towel around my face and went upstairs. The door was closed, but not locked. I knocked. No answer. I opened it. It was worse than I expected. The kitchen was wrecked. The upper cabinets were ripped from the wall, ripped, not fallen, and splintered like they'd been torn from the inside. The floor was stained with something black and sticky. Not blood. Too dark, too thick. Drag marks led from the center of the room to the far corner, and there he was. Bent backward in a way that no human body should bend. I don't mean hunched. I mean folded. His heels touched the floor and so did his face. His spine arched up like a bridge, like something had pulled his head and feet toward each other and forced the rest to comply. His mouth was wide open like he'd died mid-scream, but his eyes, they were shut. Peaceful. That somehow made it worse. I backed out and called emergency services. They came fast. One of the responders took one look and had to step outside to puke. They asked me a bunch of questions, taped off the unit, and told me to stay out. I haven't slept much since. Last night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the pacing again. Same rhythm. Same sound. Exactly the way it used to be. Back and forth, slow and steady, directly above me. Then came the scratching. Then the whispering. But this time, it wasn't muffled. It was clear. Right above my head. Let me back in. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it had to be in my head. Residual stress, maybe. Sleep deprivation. Something logical. Then came the thud. One single, solid impact. Directly above my bed. Not a creak. Not a drop. A thud, like something heavy slammed into the floorboards. This morning, I couldn't take it. I went upstairs. The police tape was still there, right across the door. No sign of tampering. Except for one thing. Someone had left a note. Stuck right onto the tape with a piece of blue painter's tape. Looked like it had been written with shaky hands. The note said, "The door is locked. But I remember the way through the walls." That was hours ago. I've kept the lights on ever since. I can't bring myself to lie down. I don't know what I'll do if I hear it again tonight. I just needed someone else to know. Just in case. My grandpa was a British infantryman in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he enlisted to serve his country, and while he thought that joining the military would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he was never deployed to Tunisia, or Italy, or the Pacific. Instead he ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. This is just some historical information, but it's important to understand before reading the rest of this story. Switzerland did its best to maintain neutral status throughout the war. But regardless of its attempts to maintain neutrality, Switzerland was still highly sought after by both the Allied and the Axis powers. Once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss military. Yet, in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its military, and subsequently, the British reinforcements, to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps. That's how my grandpa found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. At this time, it was early in the winter of 1943, and my grandpa's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. Part of the advantage that they had with this location was that it was really hard to get to and therefore had little chance of being spontaneously invaded by Nazi Germany, but this was also a disadvantage because it made communication with the rest of the Swiss military very difficult. The issue with communication was further compounded when sometime in early December, a series of blizzards swept through the region and completely destroyed the few lines of communication that they had in the first place. So, essentially trapped in this isolated Swiss village without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandpa's captain decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Weeks passed. Any roads to the outside world were buried in 7 to 9 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph/phone lines that they had were equally useless. It grew deeper into winter, the leaves were stripped from the trees and the bare trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. The town was nestled between two large mountains. Sunlight only directly reached the town for a few hours each day, making the soldiers feel as if they were living in a state of perpetual dusk. One night my grandpa was at the town bar with a few of his friends from the company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All of the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, and none of them were used to having Brits around, so one of them began shouting in broken English, "Where, take you, the children. Luckily, one of the guys my grandpa was drinking with spoke fluent German, and was able to act as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of confusion and yelling, the translator turned to my grandpa and the rest of the soldiers and said, "They say some of the village children have gone missing. They want us to do something about it." Now obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act as a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandpa and his friends told the villagers to come back to the headquarters, really just a makeshift barracks that they had thrown together in the town's church, to talk to the captain. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took about 2 hours. And basically what the captain and his self-designated translator were able to piece together was that, a few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals had noticed a variety of bizarre incidents. At first it was just benign stuff like vanishing pieces of wood and tarp from people's sheds, but over the following 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handmade ceremonial halberd, sort of like a traditional Swiss war axe, had disappeared from above his fireplace mantel. The culmination of all of these incidents was when a village child went missing. Of course, many assumed that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as the boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predatory animal. But there wasn't only one child that disappeared. There were several. The villager who entered the bar who looked especially upset. That was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing 2 days before. He had searched everywhere for them, even rounded up a posse of his fellow townspeople to join the effort, but they couldn't find a single clue as to what had happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter, and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night looking for whoever, or whatever, was the culprit behind all the strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy full-grown man on its own. Naturally, rumors began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were all young kids between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the original 3 kids who had gone missing, 7 children vanished from the town. Many people in my grandpa's company were growing suspicious. One explanation that got passed around was that impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers for extra cash. But even that didn't make sense because the roads into and out of the town were still blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. At this point it was early spring and the snow was starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally when my grandpa was on patrol with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the children's and Reginald's disappearances. It was sometime past midnight when my grandpa and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandpa was at the opposite end of the street, so at first the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. My grandpa and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and it immediately tore itself away from the window and began running away. Everyone in the patrol was certain that this was what was behind the disappearances and break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night screaming at whatever it was to stop. They kept running, and soon they found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep. The figure jumped into the ground. It looked like it had vanished into thin air at first, but as the patrol grew closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out and show itself, several gunshots exploded out of the entrance to the snow cave. Without thinking, my grandpa and the rest of the patrol shouldered their weapons and all began firing into the hole. Silence. They waited for what seemed like hours, but was really just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down and crawled into the cave. Several seconds later, he emerged with a completely horrified expression on his face. My grandpa took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave, when he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange occurrences in the town. The figure that they had been chasing was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks before. They had shot Reginald right through the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, but also the bodies of 7 partially eaten children. Either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or some sort of terrible mental issue, Reginald had gone completely insane and had begun breaking into the villagers' houses, and snatching their children from their homes in the middle of the night. He had used the halberd that had been reported missing to dismember the bodies after he slit the children's throats and hid them in the cave he carved into the snowdrift. TLDR, my grandpa was stationed in the Swiss Alps during World War II, got snowed in a remote village. Kids began disappearing from the village. Turns out one of the soldiers that had gone missing from his company actually was abducting the children and cannibalizing them in a hidden snow cave that he had constructed on the outskirts of the town. I like a good ghost story. When I was younger, there were these series of books called Haunted Philippines and True Philippine Ghost Stories that contained ghost stories and paranormal experiences from various people across the country. Some stories were in English, while the rest were in Tagalog. They were quick to read and had numerous volumes. Sometimes they even had a section of ghost pictures near the end. You know the kind, nonchalant landscape or family pics with a blurry figure circled in red. Some of them actually looked convincing and downright creepy. I loved that series, though I should have enjoyed them while they lasted. As of last year, they seem to have been discontinued and are difficult to find in bookstores now. To me, these books were just good entertainment. Growing up in the Philippines provided no shortage of ghost stories and mythical legends. It seemed like everyone had a story to tell or knew someone who had one. I've had a handful of relatives in my family who claimed to have had encounters with a ghost, or multo, as we called them in our native tongue. I never thought I'd have my own stories to share, but that quickly changed very recently. My family and I had recently taken a trip back to the Philippines. It was long overdue, as I had not seen my relatives and my home country in several years. It was a bit strange to see all my younger cousins grown up. It was a great experience just to see them all again and spend time with them. On our first week there, we were on our way back to my aunt's house from a long day of shopping when the conversation in the car turned to supernatural occurrences. Our culture is heavy on religion and tradition, and we can be very superstitious at times. There are numerous stories of mythical monsters in Filipino culture, and hearing about them from my parents and relatives only furthered my interest. They included the tikbalang, which was a monster that frequented the forests in the mountains. It is described as a large humanoid creature with the head and limbs of a horse. Basically BoJack Horseman. The copper was more of a tale for kids. It's described as a tall troll-like creature that resides in large trees, where it smokes a cigar, waiting to scare off children that are out too late at night. He's usually regarded as non-violent though. Another one is a Tiyanak, and they're the stuff of nightmares. In remote areas near forests, you'd hear the faint crying of a baby. If you followed these sounds deep into the woods, it could lead you to being perpetually lost. Or if you were really unlucky, you'd find the source. You'd stumble upon what looks like a baby on the ground, but in actuality it's a small ghastly creature that will transform and eat you if you got too close. Then there's the aswang, a shape-shifter that feeds on human flesh at night. A specific species of them, called a mananagal, which translates literally to remover, is a particularly terrifying one. By day they are in the form of a regular woman, but by night, they feed. They root their legs to the ground as their top half detaches itself, sprouts bat-like wings and takes flight. They mainly target pregnant women, and they have long vine-like tongues that slither down and eat the fetus as they hover right outside the window. I know, pretty crazy stuff, right? I've always regarded these tales with a healthy amount of salt and a full dose of fear. They were cool and unique, but I could happily live the rest of my life not encountering any of them if they were indeed real. Even when I moved to America, I was still wary of those regional creatures. Anyways, during the car ride, my cousins spoke of strange sightings and experiences they've had, all with varying degrees of believability and silliness. My dad relayed some tales from his younger years about how his group of friends would encounter this and that. He was always ever so dramatic with his storytelling. It was all in good fun, but throughout the whole conversation, my mom remained quiet. She was the hard skeptic type, and would always dismiss those stories as silly folklore. However, at that moment, it looked like she had something to say. My curiosity took over, and I finally asked her if she had any ghostly encounters. She looked at me and nodded. Back during her college years when she was studying to be a nurse, she lived on the campus of a very old school not too far from the city I was born in. Living conditions were pretty rough, and 4 of them had to share a room half the size of a normal American college dorm. On top of that, the campus used to be an infirmary during World War II. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides passed through and died within the walls of that hospital. Residents of the dorms would speak of strange noises in the night. Footsteps, faint echoes, and knocking were heard in certain parts of the building. There were rumors that the place was also a temporary orphanage at one point in time, and that a handful of children had died there. They said you could hear children's laughter in the walls if you listened closely. On more than one occasion, my mom and her roommates would wake up to faint shuffling noises in the room, like someone small was moving about. When they looked around, they wouldn't see anyone, so they dismissed it and went back to sleep. It wouldn't be until the following morning that they saw what looked like footprints on the walls and ceiling. They were the size of a child's. One of her roommates moved out after that. One night, a close friend of my mom was heading back to her room after a late study session. She was wary of the supernatural, so she kept her head down and walked quickly through the halls. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, something caught her eye. That large room used to be a triage area when the place was still a hospital. The old rusted beds were left there abandoned, and the room was used for storage. She said she saw half a dozen men lying on the beds. They looked injured and bandaged, and they wore what looked like the uniform of an American soldier from World War II. She stood frozen in place as she felt the coldest chill she'd ever experienced in her life. Then one of the soldiers sat straight up, and slowly turned towards her. That was enough to snap her back to her senses, and she took off running towards her room. When she got to her dorm and told her friends what she saw, the brave ones of the group headed to the room to investigate. When they got there, the beds were empty. Ever the skeptic, my mom didn't put much stock in those stories. That is until one early morning, when she experienced something that challenged her stance and bothers her to this day. In the mornings before classes, my mom would wake up extra early so she can get first dibs on the showers in the community bathrooms. It wasn't too hard, since a lot of the residents had convinced themselves that the place really was haunted, and were unwilling to venture out on their own that early. My mom mostly ignored those stories, and she always got to class early. That morning she did her usual routine and it went off without a hitch. As she was walking back to her room, she heard it. She said it sounded like whispers. She stopped and turned around. Down the hallway, a figure stood just at the edge of darkness. The lights weren't in the best condition in that wing, so it was dim. Still, my mom could discern that the figure was dressed like a nun. That didn't make any sense, since there were no nuns on campus, and the nearest church was several miles away. Staying completely calm, my mom turned and walked away. She quickened her pace and her own footsteps echoed in the empty hall. She strained to hear any other noises but heard none. When she turned right to another hallway, she saw the nun from the corner of her eye. It was closer, and definitely following her. As she got closer to her dorm, she turned around once more. The nun was at the end of the hall, just as far away from her when she first saw it. The nun stood still, as if she'd been standing there the whole time. My mom quickly reached her door and struggled to unlock it. Daring one more look, she turned to her left but the nun was gone. Relieved, she turned the lock. As she did, She moved to pick up her stuff and felt an unnaturally cold chill. She slowly looked right, and it was right there. The nun. On the other end of the hall. Except now she was much closer. And fully in the light. On instinct, my mom turned the knob and threw her door open. And that's when the child ran out. A small, kindergarten-aged child ran out of her dorm room, brushed past her leg and ran towards the nun. The child was laughing innocently, as if playing a game of tag. My mom watched as the child ran past the nun and disappeared into another room. After a few moments, the nun turned and followed the child. My mom asked around after that experience and learned that the last time there were children or nuns in the campus was back when it was a temporary orphanage several years ago. They shut it down after a tragic fire killed a dozen children and a few nuns looking after them. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that. After she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. Mom had been holding out on me. I was thrilled, but also terrified of what I'd just heard. See, at the time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious and nowhere near obsession levels. I wasn't out to prove that the afterlife existed, nor was I determined to find out if ghosts and spirits were real to find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really, but I'd be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I like reading up on urban legends and enjoy hearing ghost stories, I'm also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the best of me when I'm alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox. Kinda like how at one point in my childhood, I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was deathly afraid of encountering one out in the wild. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that. After she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. Mom had been holding out on me. I was thrilled, but also terrified of what I'd just heard. See, at the time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious and nowhere near obsession levels. I wasn't out to prove that the afterlife existed, nor was I determined to find out if ghosts and spirits were real to find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really, but I'd be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I like reading up on urban legends and enjoy hearing ghost stories, I'm also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the best of me when I'm alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox. Kinda like how at one point in my childhood, I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was deathly afraid of encountering one out in the wild. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out in the balcony having a drink. He offered me a beer, since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey Tito, do you remember anything about that bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments. He cut straight to the chase. "You were really young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much." Now I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind. Memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity, as if it happened just yesterday. By the time he had finished the story, there was no denying it. I had encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was the mid-90s and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventure and exploring. Once or twice a week, I would spend the night at my uncle's farm, back then a small budding business. The town it was in was smaller then, and fairly remote. I loved that place because there was so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night I was over at his place, just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At the time, he only had a few farm hands and they all had the night off. Usually he wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out in the balcony having a drink. He offered me a beer, since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey Tito, do you remember anything about that bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments. He cut straight to the chase. "You were really young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much." Now I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind. Memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity, as if it happened just yesterday. By the time he had finished the story, there was no denying it. I had encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was the mid-90s and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventure and exploring. Once or twice a week, I would spend the night at my uncle's farm, back then a small budding business. The town it was in was smaller then, and fairly remote. I loved that place because there was so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night I was over at his place, just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At the time, he only had a few farm hands and they all had the night off. Usually he wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. As he headed out, he asked me if I wanted to tag along. Ever the restless child, I immediately agreed. My uncle had an old Toyota SUV that he used for all his delivery pickups. I sat in the second row, my usual spot, while my uncle slid into the driver's seat. Most of the voyage was uneventful. It was nearly 11 p.m. at night, so there was hardly any other vehicles on the road. Upon crossing the bridge the first time, nothing happened. During that time the bridge was newly constructed. It was put up the year before after the original bridge was ravaged by the last typhoon. The city even put street lights on the new bridge for better visibility. That was a huge deal since none of the other surrounding roads had streetlights. We arrived at the next town and I helped my uncle load up the supplies. Well, at least as much as a small 6-year-old can. On the way back home was when it happened. I was sitting in the back seat, absent-mindedly looking out the window, when I felt the car slow down. We were almost at the bridge and I noticed that something wasn't right. I was too small to see over the seat and out the windshield, but I could tell that all the lights on the bridge were off. At this point the car slowed to a crawl. "Hey sport, why don't you lie down and take a little nap?" my uncle said from the front. Something in his voice didn't sound right. It sounded like he was scared and was struggling to hide it. "No, that's okay. I'm not tired. Please. Just do it for me, okay?" He sounded stern but measured. My uncle was usually an easygoing guy, so when he got serious, you should pay attention. "Okay," I said as I laid down on the seat sideways. I briefly saw my uncle's eyes in the rearview mirror. They showed unmistakable fear. I felt the familiar bump that signaled that we were on the bridge, then the car stopped. "Close your eyes, okay? No matter what, keep them closed." "Okay." I started to get scared. I didn't know what was happening or why I had to close my eyes. Regardless, I shut them tight. Then, the strangest thing happened. My uncle started to sing. It was a traditional Filipino folk song and I'd only heard it once before. About a year ago, my aunt and uncle got into a shouting match, as in a "things were thrown across the room" type of shouting match. I was at their house at the time and my cousins and I stayed in their room, cowering and waiting for the storm to pass. An hour later, my uncle entered the room and apologized for the shouting. He then started singing that song to lull us to sleep. The melody was beautiful, and I'd never known my uncle could sing that well. He never did it again. At least not until that moment, when we were in that dark bridge. The song sounded just as beautiful, but I could tell his voice was shaking. His car wasn't that big, but I was a small child and there was a lot of room in the second row. I was lying down on the seat perpendicular to the windows, trying and hoping for sleep to come. Instead, something else arrived. Click click. I heard the familiar mechanism of the headlights flashing. All of a sudden I sensed that I wasn't alone in that second row anymore. My spatial awareness of the car told me that there was someone or something else sitting right next to me. We had gained another passenger. I shut my eyes even tighter as my uncle began to drive. At least not until that moment, when we were in that dark bridge. The song sounded just as beautiful, but I could tell his voice was shaking. His car wasn't that big, but I was a small child and there was a lot of room in the second row. I was lying down on the seat perpendicular to the windows, trying and hoping for sleep to come. Instead, something else arrived. Click click. I heard the familiar mechanism of the headlights flashing. All of a sudden I sensed that I wasn't alone in that second row anymore. My spatial awareness of the car told me that there was someone or something else sitting right next to me. We had gained another passenger. I shut my eyes even tighter as my uncle began to drive. The temperature inside the car became cold. I curled myself into a ball, seeking refuge from whatever it was that was now right next to me. I didn't know much about ghosts and supernatural creatures at that age, and though I couldn't see it, something told me that I was in the presence of something not of this world. My uncle finished the song and started over again. I was amazed that he was able to keep his composure. I refused to open my eyes. I could hear her. So uncomfortably close next to me. At first, I heard what sounded like clicking. As it increased in volume, it sounded like stalks of celery being twisted and broken. Crack 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 crack. It was unnerving. Those sounds weren't normal. They were all around me. We finally crossed over the bridge, but she was still there. I was so scared I could barely move. The car hit a bump which caused me to slide to the side. Closer to her. I felt damp cloth against my leg. My breaths became shallow and I started to cry. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I opened my eyes for a split second. In that split second, I saw her. A brief flash of white, with stringy damp hair on her head, blacker than night. She was turned away from me. I blinked the tears from my eyes. When I opened them again, the mass of black hair was now right in front of my face. I shut my eyes tight again. After what seemed like an eternity, the car hit a familiar curve on the road that signaled the entrance into our town. I felt that entity come even closer to me. By this time my uncle was silent. No more songs. The air became even colder right next to my face and I shook, not from the cold but from terror. Then she spoke. Right into my ear. It was a hushed whisper, lower than any whisper I've ever heard. I couldn't make out what she said. It didn't sound threatening or angry. It sounded sad. And then she was gone. I immediately felt the difference. I could no longer feel another presence in the car, and the air went from cold to tropical humid again. I heard my uncle breathe a sigh of relief. I didn't open my eyes until we had reached the safety of the farm. My uncle had to carry me back inside and straight into my bed, and only then did I open my eyes. From what I could recall, we never spoke of that night to anyone, not even each other, ever again. Subsequent trips across the bridge at night never resulted in another white lady sighting, at least not for me. I'd find out later that in the early 80s a woman was found dead at the bottom of that bridge. People said that she was traveling to the next town and was hoping to catch a ride with any passing vehicles. It was late at night, and she had no family nearby that could give her a ride. No one knows what really happened, but many suspected that it was murder. After my trip back to the Philippines, I couldn't stop thinking about that night at the bridge. How could I forget such an incredible and terrifying experience? I guess it doesn't matter since I remember it now, but there was something else I realized about that night, something I hadn't remembered before. When I heard her whisper, I thought I only heard unintelligible garble. But that's not true. She did say something. She said, "Maraming Salamat." You've just listened to another whispered nightmare. We hope it haunts your dreams, just enough. For more terrifying tales under the rain, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a whisper. Sleep tight, if you can.